Welcome, everybody, to the Geeking Poetic podcast channel. I'm your host, Larry Roberts, and this is another installment of This Month in Rock History. And on this show, we highlight a bunch of significant historical facts that happened during a particular month. In this case, we're talking about the month of August. And more specifically, we're talking about rock history facts, whether it's album releases or Billboard chart listings. All those kind of things are featured on here. Now, if you're not into long-form videos like this, don't fret, because this is a compilation of another feature we do every week called This Week in Rock History, where we do little 1-minute shorts on specific historical events from the history of rock and roll. So you can check out those shorts here on YouTube as well as over on Instagram and our TikTok. And please don't forget to hit like and hit that subscribe button down there so that you'll be notified when the new segments come out. Without any further ado, let's get into some rock history. So coming up first, we took a look at the top 10 singles chart from 38 years ago. Yes, we're talking about August 4th, 1986. This was according to the Billboard music charts. These were the songs that people seemed to really love at the time. Let's see how many of them you remember. And there you have it. Those were the top 10 singles in the US on the Billboard charts on that day back in 1986. It's interesting seeing some of the comments from some of you, because some people said, oh man, these are the greatest songs ever. And then other people sat there and said, man, I don't even know some of these songs. And it just goes to show that just because something made it into the top 10, whether it was back then or even today, it doesn't automatically mean it's going to be a forever classic. So yeah, it's very interesting. I love getting those comments and that feedback from you guys, so please keep it coming. Moving on, we highlighted an album that ended up being a pretty important album in the grand scheme of things for the band Led Zeppelin. Why? Because this ended up being their last full studio album that they ever did, because this came out in August of 1979, and only a year later, just barely over a year later, Led Zeppelin lost their drummer, the legend John Bonham. And that was it. We got other albums like Coda and a bunch of compilations and stuff after that, but this was the last time that all four members were in the studio together creating their magic. And it's a little bit of a contentious album with some fans. What album am I talking about? I'm talking about In Through the Outdoor. This week in rock history, we look at the 8th and final studio album by the British rock legends Led Zeppelin, titled In Through the Outdoor. Released in August 1979, it marked a slight change in direction, with John Paul Jones taking a larger role in the writing and production, which was dominated by more keyboards and synthesizers than on past records. The album sold very well, though it does have a divided opinion from many fans. But songs like In the Evening, Fool in the Rain, and the heartfelt All My Love have become favorites of many rock fans, with opinions becoming more favorable towards the album over the years. And as always, they came up with a creative packaging concept with its various album cover photos and the paper outer sleeve, making this a fun record to collect. But sadly, this was the last full album to feature drummer John Bonham, who passed away in 1980, effectively ending the band. Yeah, so there you have it. In Through the Outdoor, it's one of those albums that when I was younger, I liked it okay, but it didn't hit me in the same way as other albums like Physical Graffiti or Houses of the Holy. It had such a different sound to it. As mentioned, it had a lot to do with John Paul Jones and his influence on it. As I've gotten older and I've lived with the album for all these years, I've really grown to like this album a lot. And I've seen that kind of reflected in a lot of your feedback as well. It seems like a lot of other fans feel the same way. Maybe it's just one of those albums. Maybe it was ahead of its time, or maybe we just weren't mature enough yet to appreciate it. Whatever it is, I'm really glad that we did get this album because it has some stone cold classics on it. All right, so up next we have another look at the Billboard singles chart. This time it's from 37 years ago, when we focused on the top 10 singles from August 8th, 1987.
What's into you?
My name is Luca. I live on the second floor. You little bit of heart and soul. You little bit of love.
Break down, take down, you must stare. Got this paper, and he's away my hands out. Still haven't found what I'm looking for.
And there you have it. Those are the top 10 singles from the Billboard charts of 1987. It's interesting. I'd love to know your thoughts on this at home. To me, right around 1987 signaled a pretty significant change in style and sound with a lot of the popular music that was going on. 80s music, people like to lump all of the 80s music together into one just kind of generalized category. And to me, I don't really think that works. I feel like the first half or so of the decade of the 80s did have a signature sound to it. But once we got past 86 and especially into 87 and on, I feel like the production and the songwriting style, even like the synthesizer sounds and the drum machines and the way they were becoming more and more prevalent in the music really changed the sound of it. So to me, 80s definitely is not all one lump sum of a type of style or sound. I think it's much more varied than people give it credit for. And moving on from there, we're going to get into something a little bit heavier now. Back on August 12th, 1991, one of the biggest rock albums, heavy rock albums, metal albums. Some people don't consider this to be metal. Other people say this is undoubtedly metal. But it was a big release no matter which way you look at it. It came out that day and there was a lot of anticipation. I remember so well when this album came out. A lot of nervousness amongst fans because people were worried about which way the band went. Some people loved it. In fact, millions and millions of people loved it, but some people didn't love it. What album am I talking about? I'm talking about the self-titled album, otherwise known as the Black Album, by the band Metallica.
This week in rock history, we focus on the 33rd anniversary of one of the most successful albums of all time, none other than Metallica's Black Album. Released August 12, 1991, the album was released as a self-titled record, but came to be referred to as the Black Album by most fans. Anticipation for this album was really high, as Metallica had already become one of the most highly regarded and successful bands in the 1980s, and fans were anxious to see where they'd go in the 90s. With the release of the first single, Enter Sandman, it became clear that their sound had gotten bigger and had taken the next step into something a bit more commercial than heard on their previous albums. Now this caused a rift for some fans who felt like the change was too much, but the album went on to produce 5 hit singles and eventually sold well over 30 million copies worldwide. Whether you love it or hate it, there's no denying that the Black Album was a success and pushed Metallica towards arguably being the biggest metal band of all time.
And there you go. If you were around back then, you'll remember that this was a really highly anticipated album. There was a lot of anticipated albums coming out around that time, because you had Guns N' Roses with Use Your Illusion, you had this one, Skid Row put out a big album at the time. And it's interesting because, as many people know, by the time we got to the end of 1991, tides were turning, things were getting away from metal and hard rock, and it was going more towards alternative music. And the Black Album really sits right there at that precipice of change, and it's so interesting to see how opinions have changed over the years about this album and about the band. Some people have grown to love it more. Some people say, no, this was the beginning of the end for Metallica. I think it's a great album, and I still enjoy it all these years later. All right, so for you classic rock fans, don't feel left out. I know we're focusing a lot on the 80s and 90s here, but we're going to set the Wayback Machine all the way back to August of 1974. And we're going to talk about a greatest hits compilation. Now, normally we don't talk about greatest hits albums too much on here. We focus on the all new stuff and everything. But this one I feel is significant for a bunch of reasons, not least of which because this album, not only is it a big album and an influential album, but it also marked the end of an era for this band. What band am I talking about? I'm talking about Alice Cooper and their greatest hits album.
This week in rock history, we're focusing on a classic compilation from the shock rock legends Alice Cooper with their greatest hits album. Released in August 1974, this album features most of the band's best-known songs from the early days. Tracks like I'm 18, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Elected, and many others are featured here. And it truly highlights the diversity and unique sound of the original lineup. Sadly, the release of this album marked a significant point in the band's history, as at the time, Alice decided he was going to pursue a solo career, leaving the other four members to carry on separately under the moniker Billion Dollar Babies, who then only released one album. But to this day, the greatest hits album continues to be fondly remembered by many fans, who say that this was their gateway into discovering the greatness of Alice Cooper.
So yeah, I've seen a lot of you out there talking about how the greatest hits album from Alice Cooper was the album that sort of drew you into being a fan of Alice. A lot of people might have known one or two songs of his, but you really don't realize how much great material that band put out in a very short period of time, because again, by 1975, Alice was solo. He had the Welcome to My Nightmare album out. The other guys went their separate paths eventually, and they have reunited in recent years on several occasions, and it's really great to see Alice and the rest of the guys getting back together and rekindling that old spark, because honestly, as much as I love Alice's stuff that he's done over the last 50 years since he went solo, the stuff he did in those early years between 1969 and 1974, it had its own style and its own sound, and yeah, it's my favorite. All right, we're going to jump forward a little bit to the early 1980s, but it's appropriate that we move on to this from Alice Cooper, because here is a band that was definitely influenced by Alice Cooper, and you could hear it on this debut album of theirs. This was a band at the start of the 80s that managed to blend a bunch of different styles and influences there into their music and somehow create something that sounded fresh and new. And truthfully, this band never really sounded the same again after this album, even though they went on to do some other great stuff. This album really stands on its own. What album am I talking about? I'm talking about the debut album from none other than Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love.
This week in rock history, we highlight the debut album from one of rock's most notorious bands, none other than Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love. It was initially recorded and released independently by the band at the end of 1981, but once they signed a deal with Elektra Records, it was re-released worldwide in August of 1982. Producer Roy Thomas Baker was hired to remix and polish up some of the rougher edges, and the two versions are considerably different from one another. Stick to Your Guns was dropped entirely, and other songs were edited down and put in a different running order. But even so, Too Fast for Love still retains its raw, punkish energy throughout, with songs like Livewire and Take Me to the Top emphasizing a speed and aggression that we'd rarely hear again from Motley Crue after this. So do you like this album? And which version do you prefer? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, man, what a great album that is. And judging by the comments and feedback I got from a bunch of you out there, you all feel the same way. I've seen a lot of people saying that Too Fast for Love is their favorite Motley Crue album, or a bunch of people that said that's the only Motley Crue album they liked. And I kind of understand that because, like I mentioned earlier, it does stand on its own. By the time they got to Shout at the Devil, the production style changed, even some of the writing style changed, and they just never really recaptured that sort of vicious edge that they had on that first album. And that first album went on to influence tons of bands, even bands today. And I was one of the fortunate kids that just happened to stumble on this album back in late 1982. Somebody turned me on to it and said, hey, this looks like something you might be into. I'd never heard of them. I'd never read an article about them, but I got my hands on Too Fast for Love and I loved it. And then within a year or so, everybody at my school was talking about them because Shout at the Devil came out. The band blew up big, but I was there at the beginning, more or less anyway. But yeah, what a great album. Moving on, since we are focused on the early 80s here, we're going to talk about the Billboard Top 10 Singles chart from August 25th, 1984. Yes, 40 years ago, these were the songs taking over the airwaves. Let's see how many of these songs you remember.
I wear my sunglasses at night so I can. You put me in a state of shock. All of mine, I can dream about you. I ain't missing you. Thank you. Stuck on you. Got this feeling down deep in my soul that I just can't lose.
Oh, what love got to do with it?
Something strange in your neighborhood. Who you gonna call?
Oh man, what a great batch of songs. You've got Prince in there, you've got Ray Parker Jr. with Ghostbusters. I mean, who doesn't know and love Ghostbusters? She Bop by Cyndi Lauper. 1984 was just such a unique and cool time for pop music. It was all over the place. Again, on the charts, you even had bands like the aforementioned Motley Crue and Rat and Whitesnake, but then you had Prince, you had Michael Jackson, you had Cyndi Lauper, Madonna. What a really cool time to be growing up and listening to the radio and watching MTV and looking at the Billboard charts and seeing what was taking off and what was sliding down. It was a lot of fun, and that's part of why I like talking about it here. All right, and we're wrapping it up, unfortunately, on a little bit of a somber note. Since we're talking about the 80s, we have to talk about Greg Kihn. He was a great songwriter and musician that he did get his start in the late 60s and 70s, but he really rose to prominence in the 1980s with a handful of great radio hits. Unfortunately, he did leave us just recently, and well, here, check this out.
This week in rock history, we highlight the artist Greg Kihn, who it was just announced that he passed away on August 13th, 2024, due to complications related to Alzheimer's disease. Greg grew up infatuated with the Beatles and started honing his own style modeled after them and all the other rock and pop influences from the late 60s. In the 70s, he relocated from Baltimore to San Francisco, where he signed with a small record label there and spent the next few years honing his craft. He finally got his first major hit in 1981 with The Breakup Song, which went to number 15, but his follow-up single, 1983's Jeopardy, took him to the top, where he got the number 2 song on the Hot 100 charts. He continued to release material for years afterwards, and was a regularly touring artist as well as becoming a prolific writer and radio personality. His recent passing is definitely sad, but it's had many artists and fans coming together to remember him and his great contributions to the music world.
Yeah, it's a real shame that Greg Kihn is not with us anymore. 75. It might seem old to some people, but anymore, 75 is not that old. You've got a lot of rockers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are well past 75 that are still out there touring, and some of them are still making some great original music. It's a shame that we won't get to see and hear new things from Greg Kihn anymore, but thank goodness that we have all those great hits of his to still listen to, even though they just don't write them like that anymore. All right, and that's it for this month in rock history, looking at the events that happened in August throughout the years. I know there's a lot of stuff that we could have talked about, but I want to hear from you. What do you think we should have talked about, and what would you like to see and hear more of us talking about in the future? You can make sure that you leave comments below. You can join us over on Facebook. We have a group there called the Geeking Squad, where we invite everybody to talk about this stuff, as well as talking about retro movies, video games, toys, comics, all that kind of fun stuff. Come there and talk about it with us. Also, make sure you like and hit the subscribe notification so that you are well informed when we have the latest music, toy, and just geek stuff to talk about, and all that fun stuff that we can share with you. And in the meantime, don't forget to check out the This Week in Rock History shorts. And we have a bunch of new stuff coming out. This month, we just did a review of the Kiss Dynasty 45th anniversary vinyl re-release thing, if you're into Kiss. Also, we just started a whole new series of classic rock trivia. Each episode, we're going to do 20 questions of classic rock trivia, and they range from pretty simple to some stuff goes pretty deep. So check those out, share it with your friends, watch it when you're on your lunch break, whatever, and leave comments and let us know how you did, how many questions you got right, and what you got wrong. And that's it for us this time. We will see you next month with This Month in Rock History. In the meantime, keep on rocking. We'll see you soon.